Hello and welcome to another Hot Topic. This time I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Martin Vickers, Conservative Member of Parliament for Cleethorpes and Immingham. Martin, welcome. Thank you very much for coming in.
Okay.
Let's start off with some of the bigger political stories. It's a while since we've seen each other. Just the other week there was a cabinet reshuffle. I noticed that you're not Chancellor of the Exchequer. What on earth has gone wrong?
I'm thankful for that. I think the nation's probably thankful as well.
It was a bit of a mess though, wasn't it, for the Prime Minister?
It went like clockwork.
Well, she quite clearly couldn't get rid of or remove Jeremy Hunt from Health, which she clearly wanted to do. She must have been disappointed by the departure of Justine Greening, who did not want to move from Education and wasn't going to stay around if she couldn't finish her work there. So it demonstrates that the Prime Minister is not... The patronage of the Prime Minister is to give and deprive people of jobs in the Cabinet and in the government. She doesn't have that power. She doesn't have that control over her own government.
Well, I know that the sort of narrative for the last week has been that she wanted to move Jeremy Hunt. I've no idea whether she did or not, but I find it incredible that they wouldn't have had a private conversation about this beforehand, and he would have said, look, you know, I said when you first appointed me that I wanted this to be my last big job in politics, and I want to see it through. And on that basis, I'm amazed that, you know, it's been reported as it is. I don't know what conversations took place, but it just seems strange to me that she would try and move him against his will. You know, the alternative is to sack him, of course.
Well, I mean, clearly that conversation didn't happen in advance because he was sitting there, presumably one likes to imagine it in a chair in the corridor outside her office, but he was in Downing Street for hours and hours.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what took place in Downing Street any more than you or any of the viewers do, but I'm personally pleased that he stayed in post. I think he's very committed to the NHS. He's very conscientious and sympathetic towards the aims and objectives that the British people want from the NHS. He's got a massive challenge, as we all know. The NHS desperately needs a complete rethink, to be perfectly honest, if it's going to be sustainable in anything like its present form. And we all want it to remain free to the point at the point of need. But achieving that is incredibly difficult. The demands on the service, not just from an ageing population, but from the younger generations who now expect a lot more from their health service than perhaps my generation. So it's a massive challenge.
Well, it's a bottomless pit, isn't it? I suppose the NHS, I mean, there's never going to be enough money until we're immortal.
No, since day one there has been rationing. It was rationed by waiting lists. Now, you know, we pour more and more money in because we have targets to meet, and waiting lists, let's be honest, are much less than they were 20, 30 years ago.
Well, waiting lists were a way that they could defer the expenditure of treatment and keep the accounts straight, as it were. That's no longer possible, and is that one of the reasons why we have reports of the usual winter crisis in the NHS?
I mean, you know, 20, 30 years ago, there were winter crises in the health service. It's just that they because there weren't national targets and the government wasn't so prominent in overseeing every aspect of the service. But I think it was perceived differently.
Martin, the English winter does happen at predictable and easily foreseeable intervals. Is there not a bit of poor management by Mr. Hunt that the NHS finds itself frequently in a crisis in the winter?
I think there's an element of poor management by individual management at health trusts, because why would you schedule so many operations in the first half of January when you know there is always a spike in emergency cases at that time?
Just one more thing on the cabinet reshuffle. We've seen in the recent months with Damien Green and Priti Patel that it's easy enough if you make a mistake to find yourself out on your ear from the cabinet. And yet, on that matter of competence, in February 2017, David Davis, the Brexit Secretary of State, said to Parliament, "We continue to analyse the impact of our exit across the breadth of the UK economy, covering more than 50 sectors. I think it was 58 at the last count, to shape our negotiating position." I emphasise the words there, to analyse the impact. In June, he said on the Andrew Marr Show, "We've got 50, nearly 60 sector analyses already done. We've got planning work going on in the customs. We've got planning work going on in 22 other issues which are critical, 127 all told." On the 1st of November, Parliament said we'd like to see these impact analyses. And on the 6th of December, Mr Davis went to the Brexit Committee and said that those were not available, that they hadn't been done. Much of what he did provide was redacted. And he said that there were sectorial analyses, not impact assessments, contradiction what he'd said in February. Does he feel a bit like the naughty schoolboy who says he's done his homework and then just hasn't?
Well, obviously I don't know the ins and outs of the operations at his department. But what I do know is that his department is quite genuinely, sector by sector, preparing for Brexit, because I have met ministers and officials about the seafood sector, about the impact on customs at our ports and so on. And I've come away very satisfied that a lot of work is being done.
But then why won't it be shared with Parliament?
Well, I think to share our negotiating position with Parliament is actually detrimental to the negotiating process. You cannot negotiate in public.
On the 1st of November, it was a resolution of the House of Commons that information should be shared with Parliament. Is it not detrimental to the sovereignty of Parliament, for which you fought so strongly in the Brexit campaign, if you just ignore the requests of the democratically elected Chamber of Parliament?
He subsequently produced these documents on the 6th of December, as you say.
Very heavily redacted.
Very heavily redacted, and probably redacted because he wants to protect our negotiating position. I mean, the people who constantly speculate, politicians and commentators, about our negotiating position are actually undermining the people who are doing those negotiations.
Is it the place of a Minister of the Crown, a Secretary of State, to say, no, I've decided that it's better for us not to share this information, and thus I will ignore, in fact, contradict the expressed will of Parliament?
Well, look, if he does that, of course, Parliament has got measures that can bring him to the bar of the House and force him to...
There's a cell in Big Ben, I believe.
Yeah, there is a cell in Big Ben. I think it's about 200 years since an MP was last accommodated in it. But Parliament has got the powers, if it so chooses, to bring that minister to order and to get that information, even if it is provided confidentially.
Why is it, as you say, that his department is working so hard in preparing insights that it won't share with the rest of us? What's the point? Because Mr. Davis says that he's not a fan of economic models. He thinks we've had enough of experts. There's not much point in them doing the work if the Secretary of State doesn't really approve of research or any sort of calculation or reasoning.
Well, I would draw your attention to the fact that every budget, autumn statement and so on that I have ever witnessed, the opening paragraph from the Chancellor is always by correcting the previous forecasts. In other words, the forecasts are pretty meaningless, and the only certainty is that they'll be wrong.
You're making a strong argument for shrinking Whitehall to about 7 or 8 chaps sitting around a table, Martin.
I would certainly shrink it considerably.
Let's just, with the Brexit thing, just to say one more thing. Nigel Farage, the frequent and former leader of UKIP, is now saying that we should possibly have a second referendum. Now, that's a good idea, isn't it? Let the people speak.
Oh, it's a completely balmy idea. The idea that you can rerun these decisions over and over again. There may well come a time, as there has now. After all, we did have a referendum in 1975. Well, I'm happy to wait another 42 years before we have another one. The reality is that David Cameron's government, who were, of course, arguing for a Remain vote, produced a document that went to every household at enormous expense, and you may recall there was a big row about the expense and saying it was unfair to the Leave campaign.
Rather than a campaign
that's
expense.
right, and it went to every household, and it said the government has given you the opportunity to decide, and they will implement your decision. It said that. And the government is now attempting to implement that decision. And people like Nick Clegg, who originally supported an in-out referendum, and Tony Blair and large sections of the Labour Party, and a tiny handful of Conservatives are trying to thwart the will of the people. And the government are going through the extremely complex process of trying to deliver Brexit. And these people are undermining the country. The thing is, they would be better off by supporting the government in its ambitions to get the best deal for the UK.
But would a second referendum have less legitimacy than the first one did? Any more than the 16 referendum had more legitimacy than the 75 one?
Well, if Parliament legislates for a referendum and gives it the legitimacy. But we're turning into the never-endum, as it was described at the time. And you cannot, in the same way as you cannot go arguing continually about Scottish independence or so on. There may come a time when we have another referendum for that, but it's not on the cards at the moment. And the reality is that there won't be a second referendum.
I'll have to stop you for a moment. Come back after the break. Welcome back to Hot Topic. I'm still with Martin Vickers, the Conservative Member of Parliament for Cleethorpes and Immingham. Martin, I think we've done Brexit to death now. Let's move on to something that's really quite civilised and gentle compared to Donald Trump. What a pity he's cancelled his visit to Britain in February. Are you saddened by that?
I think it's a pity, yes. I mean, put the individual Donald Trump to one side. The president of the United States is the head of the most powerful country on earth and one of our major trading partners, and on the country whom ultimately we rely on for our security. And therefore we need good relationships with the United States. Presidents will come and go. Some will be top class, some will be second rate. And the verdict, but that verdict is one for the American people. Our government's job is to deal with whoever holds that position.
So we've got to suck up to him because it's his navy that's going to protect our aircraft carriers and hold our noses even though we despise him. Well,
I wouldn't use it as sucking up. And whether you despise him or not is a personal opinion. So, some will, some won't. He's not an individual who's sort of to the taste of the British. He's a very...
It's not a matter of taste.
No, it's
behaviour towards women, apart from anything else.
Look, he is answerable to the American people. They have elected him as their head of state and head of government, and our government has to deal with whoever's there. I have to deal with the Labour Council. I'd rather it be a Conservative council, but we have we together, and that applies across the board.
Councillor Ray Oxby is similar in some ways to Donald Trump?
No, of course I'm not. But are we seriously suggesting that the United States, which has a proper constitution, a proper a judicial system, and a proper system of democracy, is different to China or Russia? Are we putting them on the same par as China or Russia? Should we not deal with Mr. Putin because he oversees a rather objectionable regime?
I asked about the man running a friendly country, not one of those ones. I would point out that the Constitution of the United States allows the president, as has just happened, to be elected on a minority with fewer votes than his opponent had.
That also applies to this country.
Well, indeed. But let's not get into those sort of constitutional discussions, much as I'd like to be. It would be lovely to talk about Trump for the rest of this interview, but we've got to move on to something a bit more local, I think. You had a bit of a victory in terms of an announcement for direct train service from Cleethorpes to London. Now, why anybody would want to go from Cleethorpes to London, I don't know. But
or the other way around, of course.
Oh, that's much more understandable. But when is that likely to happen? It's not until 2020, and it's still a route going via Doncaster.
Well, it matters not if you're going to Cleethorpes, when you get on the train in Cleethorpes and you get off at King's Cross, whether it's gone via Doncaster or Lincoln doesn't make any difference. It's a step in the right direction. It still has to get past the rail regulator, but Grand Central Trains are putting a submission into the regulator in the next few weeks. And obviously I will be doing all I can to muster support for that from both individuals and businesses and various organisations like Local Enterprise Partnership, the councils, the Chamber of Commerce and so on. They can all play a role in making representations to the regulator.
Further investment directly into your constituency, about £7.2 million to be invested in revamping Cleethorpes a little bit. And I just give for the details here, about 1.9 million from the Heritage Lottery Fund and about 3.8 million from the Coastal Communities Fund. and 1 million from North East Lincolnshire Council. And now this money is going to be spent on pedestrianising Seaview Street, Alexandra Road, I think, as well.
Well, improvements, we've got some beautiful buildings on Alexandra Road, the facades dating back to Victorian times and so on, and grants will be available to the owners of those properties and so on. So it's got great potential, and over the next 2 or 3 years, I think you'll see a real improvement in the built environment around that area.
Those buildings, with that, I know the ironwork and all the sort of images that you're thinking of, it's £1 million of council cash. I'm a North East Lincolnshire council taxpayer. Why am I subsidising businesses in Cleethorpes?
Well, not all of them are businesses. So
why am I subsidising other people who live there?
Residential. Well, you can argue that about grants that go to anyone. We have conservation. Yes. It's not a new idea. There have been conservation grants for properties that we wanted to conserve for generations. And the fact is that governments and local authorities have an important part to play in maintaining the fabric of the local environment. In this case, of course, most of the money, of course, is coming from the general taxpayer. The 3.8 million is government money, and there is, and the important thing to mention here is, of course, in the government's industrial strategy that was published a few weeks ago, the Greater Grimsby Project Board, which I'm a member, has got a particular mention as a potential pilot for various schemes that could be modelled throughout the country. So hopefully there will be more government money on its way.
Well, I'll go back to that point in a moment, just specifically for the Cleethorpes investment, which is right in your constituency. Of course, your constituency sort of donuts Great Grimsby as well. There's a symbiotic relationship. But £500,000 for the creation of a cycle hub at Cleethorpes Station. Are these bicycle stands going to be made out of gold?
I don't know the breakdown of the 500,000, but I do know that it replicates to some extent the hub that is at Grimsby Town Station, which has been very successful, and that will include the actual improvements to the property. I think it's going in the old sort of station buildings along platform 1 there, and that needs considerable improvement.
I hope you're not going to ruin that beautiful pub.
Oh no, that would be a sad loss. I don't know the details of it yet, but that's been worked through between government and local authority at the and TransPennine, who operate the station.
You mentioned the Greater Grimsby Town deal. One other thing, just on the Cleethorpes thing, I have to mention it's called, this scheme, the Discover Cleethorpes Heritage Townscape Heritage Programme. That dippy name, that can't be right, can it?
I don't know who dreamt it. If that is right, that's not a phrase I've heard before.
Repetition of the word heritage.
Yeah.
The Greater Grimsby Town deal, though, that's about £50 million over 10 years. That's a much bigger deal. As you say, you're involved in that. Is there an actual plan? It's David Ross, I think, is the chairman of the board of that. So what will he be chairing, as it were? What will that board be doing?
Well, the board has considerable expertise on it in terms of civil engineering consultants and town planners and so on. And it's got myself, Melanie On, the Grimsby MP, and it's got Norman Lamont, the former Chancellor, who spent his... But former Chancellor has contacts. It's got Lord Kerslake on it, who was formerly the head of the Civil Service. It's got a lot of people who know how the system works and who can use their expertise and contacts in order to be able to convince government that this is a project worth considering, not just for the Greater Grimsby area, but, as I mentioned, for a pilot scheme for elsewhere. And it is likely to be rolled out elsewhere. What we've got now to do is finish up the detailed discussions and hopefully finally get some of that cash allocated.
These sort of redevelopments have been tried before in Grimsby. You wind up getting, for instance, the wonderful Fishing Heritage Centre sitting there in a sort of desert of unlet buildings surrounding it. How can you be sure that that's not going to happen again? If there isn't the demand for this regeneration, why spend other people's money?
Well, the government won't just dole out the money until they are absolutely convinced that there will be long-term benefit for the area and the economy. ABP, who operate the ports, are also a key partner in this, as well as the local authority. There are no guarantees, and I take the point about the Heritage Centre. It needs a revamp, and it would be nice to think that some future project would indeed achieve that. I've got the original plans for that area around the Heritage Centre still in my filing cabinet, I think, and it was never completed, I'm afraid. I don't know, I can't recall exactly why. Downturn in the economy, perhaps, withdrawal of funding or whatever.
You mentioned that most of this money is coming from general public taxation, 7.2 million for Cleethorpes, 50 million for Grimsby. So pushing 60 million quid that's been made somewhere else, value that's been generated and created in other parts of the country, being redistributed here to this part of the country. Are you thinking of joining the Labour Party?
Well, most certainly not. You're talking about redistributing, but I mean, this is one of the arguments constituents regularly put to me. Oh, far too much money is being spent in London. They're getting Crossrail and all these sort of projects.
Far much more money is being made in London.
But the point is that the money that is made in London is, and has been for generations, then shared out so that the whole country benefits. We do actually need a vibrant London and South East economy, because it does actually benefit areas such as this, who rely on people like me to constantly be knocking on the doors of ministers to shunt some of that money northwards.
I'm very glad you're doing it, Martin. We don't have time to talk about Dad's Army patrolling Immingham, I'm afraid. Thank you very much. Join me again for another Hot Topic.